Alrighty, so our next presentation, improving management of white mold in dry beans and soybeans, Dr. Michael Wunsch from NDSU Carrington Research Center. When I phoned up Michael one day, we had this idea to talk about the white mold this year, and I called him up and I said, Michael, are you interested in coming to Manitoba in December to do a presentation on white mold? And there wasn't a hesitation, yes, right away. So that was probably the easiest sell I had to make. So Michael is a plant pathologist with North Dakota State University's Carrington Research Center. His research and outreach efforts are primarily focused on addressing disease management problems in broadleaf crops in North Dakota, with the emphasis on improving management of white mold in dry beans, soybeans, and sunflowers, and improving management of root and foliar diseases of field peas, chickpeas, and lentils. Michael obtained his BS from the University of Missouri and his PhD from Cornell University, and he commenced his employment with NDSU Research in Carrington in 2010. Michael is originally from Montana, so let's welcome Michael to the podium.
Take this thing, absolutely. All right, good afternoon. You know, no one can ever accuse you of, traveling for the wrong intent when you go to Winnipeg in the winter, right? So, no, it's a pleasure to be here. Listen, let me give you a little background. When I started in Carrington 15 and a half years ago, I made the purposeful decision to work on research questions that were not being addressed at that time by plant pathologists in North Dakota, okay? And one of those questions was white mold management. And one of the things I learned very quickly was that growers would often spray fungicides twice to the dry beans targeting white mold, and still have a disaster, have a meltdown. Anyone in this room or online who has worked with dry bean production here in these northern climates for any length of time has seen this, okay? You think like you did everything right, but you still have a complete meltdown, right? I also got the comment, well, even though we sometimes get our disasters in dry beans, we know that the fungicides work. They help us. But on soybeans, somehow we cannot get our fungicides to work. And we can't get good reductions in white mold. So, on that basis, I began working on this. Now, white mold is a harder disease than most to work with from an agronomic perspective, okay? Unlike many other diseases, white mold, as anyone who works in the real world knows, is spatially inconsistent. What do I mean by that? There are hot spots and cold spots, right? It's pretty common that you'll go out in a field and you have areas where you have lots of disease, other areas where you have no disease, and other areas that are in between. Now, if you're doing research, even if you do everything right to equalize the disease, to do your best to try to equalize the disease pressure, white mold is white mold, okay? The disease comes in from the little mushroom-like apothecia on the ground, and the concentration and the density of those little mushroom-like apothecia in any given spot in the field determines your disease pressure, especially once that canopy is closed, precluding the movement of the spores any distance. And so you get significant variability in disease pressure no matter what you do. So the way around this problem from an agronomic research perspective is you have to increase the number of replications in your study. And what do I mean by that? When we do these studies, we randomize our treatments and we put them out in the field in a different randomized pattern in blocks. Well, the standard in agronomic research is to do 4 experimental replicates, i.e. you randomize your treatments 4 times. Now, if you're doing white mold research and you only do 4 replicates, you have a very high probability that a given treatment will end up on an area of high disease pressure 3 out of 4 times. Another treatment will end up on an area of low disease pressure 3 out of 4 times. Now you tell me, if treatment number 1 ends up on an area of high disease pressure 3 out of 4 times, and treatment number 2 by random chance ends up in an area of low disease pressure 3 out of 4 times, which treatment's going to look better? Unless the treatment difference is enormous. Well, treatment 2 is going to look better, right? Right? So what's the way around this? The law of probability is that you have to increase your number of experimental replicates. And the smaller the difference that you're chasing or you're testing, the more replicates you need. Because as you increase the number of replications, the probability that any treatment ends up in high areas of high versus low disease pressure starts to approach 50%. Okay? So what we do in my program is we run all of our fungicide efficacy testing with 6 experimental replicates. Now, when you test fungicide efficacy, you're traditionally looking at pretty big differences. When you're looking at smaller differences, you need more replicates. And all of our other testing we do with 8 to 12 replicates, normally 9 to 10. Okay? The net result is the studies get huge. It's extraordinarily labor intensive, but you actually get data that translate and work for people, okay? And so any given year, my team and I are running 10 to 15 acres of irrigated dry bean white mold studies and 20 to 30 acres of irrigated soybean white mold studies, okay? And those are small plot studies, mind you. Okay, so with that introduction, I want to start today with dry beans, and I specifically want to focus on this fungicide question. We have gotten to the point that we understand why we get these train wrecks sometimes, even when we feel like we did everything right. And we have also made some degree of progress in finding a solution to that problem. Not 100%, but it gives us a direction we need to go. And then I will try to get into soybean white mold. Now, I have been doing a better job of posting information online. Google NDSU Carrington plant pathology. You'll get a couple links, only one of them is correct. All right? And if you click on that and you scroll down, you'll find a dry bean white mold section. Okay, I will update again this winter with updated information from this season, but there you'll see a lot of our research. Not everything yet, but it's getting there. Soybean white mold is a work in progress, but it'll be up this winter, okay? All right, good enough. All right, so what I want to talk about right now is fungicide application timing in dry beans for white mold. And the way I approached this research was slightly different than the normal question that people ask. Normally, when people run this type of research, what they are doing is they're asking, well, what are the conditions that favor white mold? Okay? And with the idea that you help identify when conditions become favorable for white mold, and when they do, that's when you apply your fungicide. I've looked at a different question, because it's the question I get from growers, and if I were growing dry beans, that's the question I'd want to know. If conditions favor white mold as you enter bloom, when should you spray? Okay? Very different question, but very, very, very important question. Okay? And so I've discussed how we do this research in general detail. The rest of this information is online. You can get there if you want. Here are the results, combined analysis across multiple studies from Carrington and Oaks. We do our research in Carrington and Oaks, North Dakota. And this is the response to fungicide application timing for a single fungicide application on pinto beans. Okay? And on the very top, that is the single application. On the very bottom, it would be 2 sequential applications. The growth stage you see there are the percent of plants with initial pin-shaped pods. The moment a dry bean flower senesces, it produces this tiny little pin-shaped pod. Usually we call them pin pods, okay? Okay, that's the percent of plants with pin pods. Obviously, the percent of plants with pin pods is the percent of plants that are susceptible to white mold, because once you have a pin pod, you have a senesced blossom, and the white mold comes through those senesced blossoms, okay? And these are studies where the canopy was open as we were getting into those early stages of bloom. Okay, canopy is open, that means your disease risk is a little bit lower. Okay, because you can get easier drying out of the canopy than if the canopy is closed, right? And in this case, on these studies, what we did is we made sure we irrigated to have the mushroom-like apothecia as we were entering bloom, and then we irrigated between every application, okay? And all of our application timings are 2 to 3 days apart, okay? What do you see here? As you increase the number of pin-shaped pods, okay, you improve your disease control, and you improve your yields. If you went on and sprayed when you had 10% of plants with initial pin-shaped pods, and oftentimes that can be 60% of plants with open blossoms, notice that you actually did yourself a really you made a big mistake, okay? Because your disease control improves as you wait, all right? Now, we did not expect that. I did not expect this, okay? All right. Now, what about those studies where that canopy was closed as we entered bloom? And this is combined analysis across multiple studies again. We saw very consistent results. And what do you see here? On that single application, you see that same response where the disease management improves as you wait. But now look at that with the 2 sequential applications. What do you see there? You see this bell-shaped pattern, right? So when you applied at 0 to 5% of pin pods, plants at pin pods, you had a significant penalty. When you applied at 10 to 20% pin pods, my gosh, you hit the gold mine, right? Then you waited 2 days, and you have catastrophe. Okay? Right? Now, if you go online, you'll see data for fungicide timing response on soybean. Well, I don't have the soybean stuff posted yet. If we have time today, I'll get there. All right? But you'll see it on black beans, navy beans, kidney beans. Every single one of these marker classes, we saw the exact same thing. And soybeans, we've seen the same thing. Okay? And so what's going on here? Well, these are the recommendations. Let's talk about what's going on. All right. So, when you apply a fungicide, you are protecting the canopy that's there. Okay? You will apply fungicide to the growing point. Okay? And that growing point will produce new tissue that contains that fungicide, but you tell me what's the concentration of the fungicide in that tissue? Very low, right? For all practical purposes, the only protection you get is the tissue that received the fungicide. Okay, now what's going on dry beans and soybeans at early bloom? They're growing like crazy, right? I mean, this is the period when your canopy closes, right? Okay, when you enter bloom on a dry bean, that canopy is wide open usually, okay? Even if you're pretty close to having coverage, you can see through the canopy. In 5-10 days, forget it. If you have the moisture, like it's a white mold year and you have the moisture, I mean, especially if it's high fertility, I mean, you got a closed canopy, right? There's a lot of growth going on. Okay, what you have to realize is when you apply that fungicide, what you're protecting is the canopy that's there. Okay? And you're not protecting the new growth. All right? And when you make that single application, the reason why you do better by waiting is because that single application does not protect you for that whole bloom period. Okay? does not protect you for the whole window of susceptibility. And so what you're doing is you're saying, I'm going to sacrifice a few early infections in order to protect more of the canopy when those dry beans enter the period of maximum susceptibility, when they're in full bloom and are loaded with dead blossoms. Okay? But when you're going to do a second application, what you're going to do is you're putting on a fungicide afterwards that's going to protect that canopy, and now you don't want to sacrifice those early infections. Okay? And so that's why you see the penalty to applying too late with the 2 sequential apps. You would see the penalty applying too late with 1 app if we applied later. Okay, well, we didn't test anything that late. Okay, so again, when you are making the 2 apps, you are making another fungicide application to protect the new growth. And because of that, now you don't want to sacrifice the early infections. All right? And because we all know that a fungicide will not cure an existing infection, even those fungicides that have some degree of curative activity, what they can do is they can eradicate an infection at a microscopic level within 24 hours of infection. That's it. And this is something you can't see with your eyes. Okay, and most of them have no eradicative properties, and they're only preventative. All right? So what do we do about this? Right? So here are the recommendations, and it basically rolls down to this. If you're making a single application, this would be the summary across all the market classes. You want to put that application on when conditions favor white mold as you enter bloom. Okay? Of course, if they don't favor white mold yet, you wait until they do. Okay? But otherwise, 65 to 90% of plants with initial pin pods. Okay? And you want the data for every single one of those market classes and specific recommendations, go to my website. Okay, if you're going to do 2 sequential applications and conditions are highly favorable for white mold, that application needs to go on at about 5 to 20% of plants with initial pin pods. If they're less favorable white mold, i.e. the canopy is wide open or it's really hot, you can wait till about 50% pin pod. Okay? All right, so this is what we've just discussed, and here's a beautiful picture that illustrates my point about new growth not being protected. These are, you guys don't allow anyone to sell a field pea variety that's susceptible to powdery mildew up here in Manitoba, but in North Dakota we don't have that rule, and so we have susceptible varieties, and so these peas got a fungicide application at early bloom. Anyone who's grown peas knows that the peas continue to growing as the bloom period progresses. They got a fungicide at early bloom. Here we are at late pod, and you can see that lower canopy is whistle clean, and all the new growth is diseased. Okay? So, of course, with white mold, you get infections under that new growth, it'll melt down the whole plant. You don't just get, the top of the plant diseased. Okay? All right. All right. So, at any rate, so we have a challenge here, right? You can see that you have a very small window for making an application. It's dependent on how high the risk is, and then how many fields have completely consistent growth across the whole field, where the entire field is at the same growth stage at the same time. Maybe you guys have those perfect fields all the time, but that's not my world. We'd all like to say that were the case, okay? So now you want to hit 5 to 20% pin pod across the entire field. And any part of the field that's a little bit ahead of that or behind that is going to get a penalty. Good luck. All right? This is not practical, okay? And never mind, can you even get into the field that day? The wind could be blowing 30 miles an hour, or you might have just gotten 2 inches of rain, And so these are practical considerations. Okay, so what do we do about that? Okay? Well, the only logical way that you can go about addressing this is you've got to protect that new growth. Okay? No one can get around the fact that you can't cure an existing infection. Okay? I'm sorry. Until we invent a better fungicide that can cure existing infections, forget it, right? The only thing that we can do is find ways to protect that new growth. So how do you protect that new growth? Well, you've got to apply the fungicide sooner, right? Right? So Vikram would know, on potatoes, you spray fungicides every 7 days, right? Right? Why do you do that? For the reasons I've described, right? Okay? So now the question here is, if we tighten the application interval, is that going to help us with this problem and give us more flexibility? And if we do tighten that application interval, do we now have to spray a third time? Right? I'm not saying that that's pretty on the pocketbook, but that is a logical question, right? Right? It's a potential ramification because, again, if you make that first application as you're just entering bloom, you make the next application in 7 days, you still have new growth going on after that, right? In that susceptible window. So, all right. So we went about this with these enormous studies that are a royal pain. Okay, so what we've done for the last 2 years on pinto and kidney beans is we have tested 5 application timings versus a non-treated control with a single fungicide application, with 2 sequential applications made approximately 7, 10, or 12 days apart, or 3 sequential fungicide applications made approximately 7, 10, or 12 days apart. Now, why do I say approximately? Because not every day is a spray day, and this gets huge. And I'm not quite as young as I was 15 years ago, and so walking this with a hand sprayer was kind of out of the question. All right, so we do this with a tractor. These are 6 acre studies, okay? And anyhow, so everything is done with a tractor, and we calibrate our applications. It's a pulse width sprayer. We calibrate the droplet size relative to the canopy. You can see my recommendations for that online. And then here's our tractor-based sprayer making applications to soybeans in this case, but it's the same process. I just didn't have a picture on the dry beans. Again, these are huge studies. Okay, this particular study is a relatively small one, only 4 acres, but you can see the process. You can see the tractor driving passes. We smooth those out. Actually, we bought a strawberry cultivator to do this. So we go in an early growth stage and till out the driving, actually the tire tracks, and then that allows us to have a very smooth driving pass so there's no swaying of the boom. All right, and yeah, and that's a handmade boom, by the way. Yeah, so yeah, you got to build your own stuff, right? All right, so what did we learn in the first year? Here are pinto beans, okay? And unfortunately, this was one of those studies where even with the 9 replicates, that wasn't enough to even out differences in disease pressure across the field. And what you can see across these various interval treatments is if you look at the non-treated control, the disease levels and the yield, you'll see enormous swings, all right, because of where the frequency with which they fell into high versus low disease pressure areas. This is unusual. We've really gotten pretty decent evenness of disease pressure in our fields, but this one was an exception. So, but what you can see right away, if you just simplify this down to the yield gain conferred by the fungicide, what you can see immediately is something jumps out. Pinto beans here, 3 fungicide applications made 8 to 11 days apart. Look at that yield gain from the fungicide versus the other treatments. I mean, it's a big, big difference. And the 7 days apart is also very strong, okay? And so what that would suggest is maybe 2 apps aren't enough. Okay, so what did we learn this last year? This year we had much more even disease pressure. And I've got highlighted here the numerically strongest treatment. We don't have statistical separation here, but what do you see again? You're looking at 3 apps, in this case 7 days apart. Now let me tell you a little bit about this last growing season, because I think it's the reason why I'm here, because you had the same thing up here. We didn't irrigate these dry beans once, okay? Not once, all right? We set up the irrigation systems and then never turned them on. It rained that much, okay? It was like southern Minnesota. I mean, it was unbelievable. All right, now, the other thing I'll mention here, though, is, okay, so we maximized with 3 apps 7 days apart here. But look at those disease levels. Are you going to be happy with that? That's a disaster still, right? And that's the percent of the canopy diseased, mind you. And that's not very good, but at least it's an improvement, okay? And so, all right. Now, the key question, though, that I wanted to get to is, did we, with 3 apps, give ourselves a bit more flexibility on timing? Basically, the fact that we still had a disaster means that you have to do other things as well, and we'll touch on that. But what I want to talk about now is flexibility on application timing, because I told you that yes, we want to improve disease control, but we also, our objective here is to give ourselves more flexibility on when we apply. Okay, so now let's look at the response to application timing for 3 applications 7 days apart versus 3 applications 9 to 11 days apart. You'll see on the blue bar, that's your non-treated control. The dark blue bar, the light blue bars are the response in terms of disease severity and yield. Okay, and on the very left, you'll see the 4th column over is plants with initial pods. The 3rd column over is plants in bloom. Okay, percentages. Okay, what you can see is that there's, here in the 7 to 8 days apart, you can see there's one anomaly, and that's just noise. Okay, because of these differences in disease pressure across the footprint of the study. But you can see if you take away, if you kind of overlook that second treatment, the second timing treatment a little bit, you can see actually a very consistent curve there in terms of response. Okay, as you go to the 9 to 11 days, you can see they are much more clear. Beautiful curve there in terms of response. And what you can see immediately is that the first 2 application timings to the 3rd timing perform very similarly. And what's the growth stage we're talking about? You're talking at about 0 to about 10 to 15% of plants with initial pin pods, and about 20 to 70% of plants in bloom. And you're looking at a time frame of about 5-day window. Now that gives us a lot more flexibility than we had before. Allows you to go in at the early part of bloom, and it's exactly what we hypothesized. Okay, you protect that new canopy, and now you have a lot sooner. Now you have much better disease control and much more consistent results, and you can be off by a couple days. Okay, now we did this on kidney beans as well. All right, so anyhow, these results suggest 3 apps somewhere in that 7 to 11 days apart range. We had about that 10-day interval optimizing in 2024, about that 7-day interval optimizing in 2025. The difference between the 2 years is that 2025 was much cooler and wetter, much higher risk for white mold. And so in that type of scenario, you would expect that you would have more urgent need to protect that new canopy faster. Okay, so the higher disease risk, probably the tighter you need that interval. So let's look at kidney beans. Okay, here you see the same issue with some variability in disease pressure across these various timing and interval treatments. But if you look at the yield gain, you see something jump out really fast, and it's 7 days apart, 3 apps. I mean, like, obvious jump out, okay? All right, so what do you see on 2025? Again, very obvious. Here you have statistical separation, okay? Very obvious, 7 days apart, 3 apps, unequivocal. Okay, now you look at your response to application timing, and what do you see? Again, now you have beautiful curves. We didn't have noise in these data, okay? This was nice, okay? And this is the response curve that you would expect when you have enough reps, okay? And you have relatively even disease pressure, okay? And so here you go, and you see exactly what we saw on the pinto beans. It looks like you had flexibility optimally the first 2 application timings, but you could reasonably extend to the 3rd. And what's the growth stage you're looking at? You're looking at 0 to about 10 to 15 plants with initial pods, exactly the same as in the pinto beans. And about 25 to 75, 80% of plants in bloom, very similar to what we saw in the pintos. And again, you're looking at about a 5-day window. Now that's a growth stage range that's typically found within a field. You can hit that. That number of day window, you can hit that if you're a producer. This is doable. Okay, and the other thing is look at that 7-day interval. Now we got our white mold down to just a third of the control. And we did this by spraying Endura 3 times, which is Lance in Canada. Now, it's not that I recommend applying the same fungicide 3 times, but if you're running this type of study, you want to load up the sprayer with one product and hit all of your treatments at once. Okay, this is a practical question. Okay. By spraying the same darn thing every single time, it reduced our workload by 50% when it came to spraying. And sometimes your window in the weather is such that that's the only window you got, so you better do it. All right, now we ran a separate study with hand spraying, which was my exercise, right? Where we rotated and we got better disease control. Okay, you rotate your products, you can get better disease control. All right, now in this case, we got great disease control. Really, for a white mold, this is good. All right, and we didn't rotate. Rotate, you can knock this down by a bunch more. Okay, so this is now getting to where we need to be. All right, so this is quite unequivocal, very consistent results. And mind you, I will tell you that these results are also consistent with what I have learned from producers in western Minnesota and in Ontario who, by trial and error, arrived at this result and have told me independently, okay? So, all right, very good. So what about navy and black beans? Okay, we're going to start with black beans. In this case, we did not test 5 different application timings at each one of these application intervals. Another 6 acres was more than I could handle, okay? And so we just tested 1 timing, okay? And but we did it on 2 varieties, and these are blacktail and eclipse dry beans. I know you guys grow eclipse up here. I'm not sure about blacktail, but these are commonly grown in North Dakota. And what you can see if you look at these data in detail is that there was very little gain to doing a 3rd application. It appeared that 7 to 8 day interval was optimal and 2 apps was enough, okay? But really for the 2 application sequence, there's not enough testing here to really zero in on what application interval you want with 2 apps. But these data show that indicate that the response to the 3rd app, even at that tightest interval, is very, very slight and probably not worth it economically, okay? And with navy beans, again, you're seeing, in this case, we're not seeing a response to a 3rd app, okay? 2 apps is enough, okay? And here it's quite clear that you want to be at that 7-day interval. All right, so we're at the end of what I wanted to talk about on dry beans. Before I segue to soybeans, I think I got about 10 minutes here, right? Dennis, is that about right? I got 15 minutes total. 15 minutes. Before I go into soybeans, questions about dry beans. There are other subjects we've worked on. Go online, you'll find a lot of that information. Some of the other stuff that I haven't posted online, I hope to get online this winter. Any questions? I got one. Yeah, Vikram.
I'll bring the microphone.
Got to make sure the people online can hear, you know?
Hi. Do you monitor the ascospores in the air before you decide whether you really need the fungicide application?
Okay, do we monitor the ascospores in the air before we decide to make an application? No, we do not. Okay, I just do everything environmentally that I can to make sure conditions favor white mold and we have the conditions to favor apothecia as the dry beans enter bloom or the soybeans when we do this, okay? And other than that, basically I'm just doing my best to simulate the worst case scenario in terms of rainfall patterns. Yeah. Yes, next question.
Sorry, who was it?
If you're spraying with a multiple product with a multiple times, would you use the premier product up front, or would you wait until the wait and see based on the weather?
Okay, so our testing with this our testing with rotation sequence has been based primarily on 2 application sequences. This last year, we finally tested 3 application sequences. Now, there are a couple products. You have Omega, the brand name US, and I think it's called Allegro in Canada. And you have Propulse, which is called, I think, Delero Gold, I think, in Canada. Okay? These 2 products, intrinsically, because of how they operate, should be applied first on dry beans. Okay, so fluazinam, the active ingredient in Omega or Allegro, is a contact fungicide without systemic activity. And so this product is very, very dependent on good deposition patterns for good activity. And so when you make it your first application, you maximize the chance that you can get it to your target and get really good activity. So Delero Gold or Propulse, as we call it in the US, is prothioconazole, which is proline, plus fluopyram. Now, fluopyram is an SDHI with very good systemic movement. Okay, prothioconazole, in my very long experience working with this, is a fantastic white mold product when you get deposition directly to your target. But it's an awful white mold product when you do not. Okay, and so this is why it works great on canola. Okay, on soybeans, it often fails because it's so hard to get the product down in the canopy. And to test this hypothesis, we once ran several years actually, we ran drop nozzle studies testing fungicide efficacy. And what we found is you applied Proline with a drop nozzle, it was fantastic. It doesn't matter what the canopy closure was, okay, to soybeans and dry beans, okay? But once you applied it over the top and that canopy was closed, forget it. Basically, what I'm trying to tell you is you apply Propulse or Delero Gold as the first app. At that point, your canopy is relatively open. It's quite easy to get the product inside that canopy, and you're going to get activity out of both the proline component and the fluopyram component. Okay, when you apply it later, you get activity mostly just from the fluopyram component. Okay, all right, so those are the cases where you want to put your premier product first. All right, and so, good enough. We better move on to soybeans, huh? Okay.
Yeah, it's just, okay, thank you very much for the presentation. I'm just wondering, in terms of applying 3 times, does the yield gain justify the cost?
Okay, so the question is, does the yield justify the cost of applying 3 times? And it's going to depend on your disease pressure. And I could say on the kidney beans, yes. If you're producing under high disease pressure, absolutely. The pinto beans, it looks like it. It doesn't look like it on the blacks or navies. Now, at least in the US, we have a couple cheap options now. Okay, Bosclet or Lance or Endura, whatever you want to call it, the active as Bosclet is now available generic. And we also have thiophanate methyl or Topsin, which is also affordable. And so this has become more affordable. Okay, yeah. All right, good enough. Let's move on to soybeans quick. All right, now I'm going to get soybean information online. You can Google that, but it might be March. But look, okay. Soybeans. You don't have problems with white mold in soybeans as frequently as you do dry beans, and this is why. Okay? Soybeans increase in susceptibility as the maturity length to white mold as the maturity length increases. This makes logical sense. The longer the maturity length, the longer the bloom period, which means the longer the susceptible window. So here's testing done in North Dakota, in Carrington and Oaks again, where we ran these enormous studies looking at a large number of varieties with no fungicide, 1 app or 2 apps. Okay, and you can see on the very far left are 0.5 to 0.7 maturity varieties. And then you go all the way up to a 1.0 to 1.3 maturity variety. Well, you can see as maturity length increases, your susceptibility to white mold increases, and the response to the fungicide increases, obviously. And you typically have to get into closer to a 0 maturity variety to consistently get a response from a fungicide and under high disease pressure type environments, and then to get a response to 2 apps, you know, you have to get to usually a mid-0. In North Dakota, we traditionally anticipate white mold is more of a perennial problem when conditions favor white mold in basically kind of Highway 200 and south, okay, which is kind of cuts right through the middle of kind of 60% up the state, okay? All right, and that's kind of the break point where you have these mid-zero maturity varieties. Okay, as you go north from there, white mold on soybeans becomes a really sporadic problem, limited only to the years where the risk is extremely high. Okay, so let's look at greater detail in the double zero, the data from the double zeros. And what you can see right here is our double 0.5 to double 0.7, we only looked at 6 varieties there. Okay, and we only did the testing at 1 location in 2 years. Okay, so the problem with only looking at 6 varieties is that we all know that some of these varieties are really susceptible to white mold and other ones are fine. Okay, with only 6 varieties, especially when you get to these double zeros, most of them are not really susceptible. It's harder to find a dog, okay? And double 0.8 to 0.0, you can see we looked at 12 varieties. And now if you look at the fungicide response data, every one of those dots is 1 variety in 1 study. You can see a couple of varieties, we saw a very strong response to the fungicide. Okay, so rule number 1 here, if you're growing double zeros or triple zero maturity soybeans, know that there are differences in the susceptibility of the varieties. Know that many of the soybean breeders and companies do not have the best screening data and don't really know for themselves. Make note and avoid those varieties. If you're a sales agronomist and you have experience with somebody having problems with white mold on a particular variety, make note of that because variety selection matters. Okay? Now, what this tells you right away, though, if you look at the average response to the fungicide, is that usually in these double zeros, you're only looking at 1 application of fungicide that's going to be economic, okay? And only in the very high disease pressure yields. Again, there are exceptions if you get really susceptible varieties, okay? All right, so application timing. Here's a study conducted in 24 in oaks. And what do you see here? The same thing we saw on the dry beans. Basically, you improve your disease control as you wait to get more and more plants with dead blossoms. And then if you wait too long, now you get penalized. Okay, so in this case, we're optimizing when 96% of plants are at the R2 growth stage. Okay? Now, this is very different than the standard recommendation of going out and spraying at say, 50% R1. Okay? 50% R1 will burn you on soybeans, guaranteed. Okay? And so, all right. Oaks in 24, now wide row spacing. You can see the same basic application timing, in this case 90% R2. These are wide rows. And what I'm telling you here is that canopy closure isn't your main driver here. The main driver is the percent of plants with dead blossoms. As you get to R2, you have a lot of dead blossoms out there. Okay? And so Carrington in 25, you see the same thing. We're looking at narrow rows. You are optimizing at 93% R2 with a single app. Okay? And then with the wide rows, you're looking at 88% R2, which is the latest we tested. Okay? And all right, so we did more of this testing back. Oh, this was done also in Langdon, by the way, this testing of timing here. Basically, here we had we looked at the response versus growth stage and canopy closure. And so these were studies where the soybean canopy closed at late R1. Okay? And what you can see here is that at late R1, which would be very early R2, okay, you optimize the performance of the fungicide if the canopy was closed then. Okay? And good luck with that in your stick type double zeros and triple zeros, okay? And I'm talking closed, like you're standing above it and you can't see the ground through the canopy anymore. All right? Okay, so now these were studies where our canopy closed at what I was calling early R2. This is not really early R2, 80 to 98% R2. And you can see is that we optimized when we applied concurrent with canopy closure. And here we are where the canopy closed at full R2. Now you're optimizing by applying a full R2. And finally, here are studies where the canopy closed at early R3. And notice we optimize by applying at 100% R2. Okay, so this is the only situation where canopy closure matters is when it happens early, just like in the dry beans. Okay, so later on, when you have enough dead blossoms, it doesn't matter if the canopy is open or closed, you got to spray. So the rule of thumb here, if you're going to apply a fungicide, is that you, okay. So basically, okay. If you're going to apply a fungicide targeting white mold on soybeans, you apply as soon as the soybeans reach, if conditions favor white mold as soybeans enter bloom, you apply as soon as you reach 90 to 100% of plants at the R2 growth stage, unless the canopy closes earlier, in which case you apply concurrent with canopy closure. Okay? Very easy rule of thumb. We have found that you increase the yield gain from the fungicide by 50% by doing this versus the standard recommendation of applying at R1. Okay? If you're going to do 2 apps, in short maturity soybeans, those apps should be done in 7 days apart. I don't think that applies to most of you guys. You aren't going to do 2 apps on soybeans. All right? And as you go to longer maturity beans, that interval has to increase unless you're going to do a 3rd app. Okay? And the other thing is that soybeans, applying fungicides for white mold management in soybeans, it's extraordinarily important to calibrate your droplet size relative to canopy characteristics. Okay? And I'm going to get this information online, but you can double the yield gain from the fungicide by doing this. The more dense the canopy is, the tighter the canopy closure, the coarser the droplet size needs to be. With a T-jet nozzle, you're looking at anywhere from a fine droplet to a coarse. And it matters tremendously which droplet size you use. Okay? And one of the main reasons why our growers in North Dakota, when I started working in Carrington, could not get good activity of fungicides for white mold and soybeans was because they were fogging on the fungicide. Okay, they were applying with very high pressures, very fine droplets, and that's what they were told to do because it gives you best coverage. Okay, it gives you great coverage to the top of the canopy, but the droplets do not have the velocity to get inside. Okay, and once we figured out the droplet size bit, which is actually why we built that tractor-based sprayer, mind you, to do that testing, that's when we figured out how to make fungicides work on soybeans. That and the timing question. All right, with that, thank you very much. I think we're out of time, right, Dennis? Unless it's up to you.
We got time for maybe one question real quick.
All right. Thanks so much for the presentation. There was quite a few farmers that we worked with on our on-farm network trials there with the Manitoba pulse and soybean growers that were getting recommendations to spray for white mold at R5, R6 this year. Like when we got our, I'm just throwing this out here because I fielded questions from this and I told them, you're seeing it now, but you're too late. I just want to, just to see if there's any studies, even at R3, R4, like where's the kind of the cutoff for, obviously we got our rain quite a bit later than flowering this year. We were, for Manitoba anyways. So some comments on that.
That's a very, very, very good question. A very common question. Okay. What you need to know, and with the extent of the work that I've done over the 15 and a half years, I have a lot of practical experience with applications even that late, okay? And also with all the application timing studies, you learn pretty quickly when the infection occurred versus when the disease showed up because you can see which applications worked and when you started seeing disease. Okay, what you need to know is that white mold has a very long latent period. What does latent period mean? That's the technical term. Vikram is nodding his head, he knows. That's the technical term that nerdy people use to describe the interval between when the pathogen spore infects and when you start seeing disease. Okay? It's very common that infection occurs in mid July or late July, and you don't see disease for 3 weeks, even at low levels. Now, the cooler it is, the shorter that period and the faster you'll see disease. The warmer it is, the slower the disease runs, and the later you'll see it. But the infection's occurring at the same time. Now, soybeans are susceptible to white mold as long as you have dead blossoms. But the period of maximum susceptibility is when the blossoms are in the interior of the canopy, and the susceptibility drops off sharply once you get to the later stages of bloom, where you only have some blossoms up on the top of the canopy. Okay? By R5, the only infections that you get that are coming in new are typically a few infections at the very base of the plant. Many of the soybean varieties have a very fine branch that occurs at the very base of the plant, about an inch off the ground. And you'll see infections sometimes come through that. What you'll notice, though, if you crawl through the soybean canopy, like me, is that usually what happens is that the soybean plant will wall off that infection, and it won't get in. Or if it does get in, it's so late that it cannot actually girdle the stem and take out the plant. And from a practical perspective, good luck getting your fungicide to the bottom inch of the main stem at R5. Okay, the other thing is we ran application timing studies where we applied irrigation at different growth stages and looked at the response to the fungicide versus when the infection occurred. Okay? The later the infection comes in, the lower the yield loss to the fungicide, to the disease, because this makes logical sense. If that disease comes in at R2, that disease has a whole season to run and wipe out entire plants. That disease comes in at late R4, it doesn't have as much time to progress. It also is much less likely to be on that main stem and take out the whole plant. Okay, but basically your window of susceptibility is R2, R3, R4 in terms of maximum susceptibility to white mold. R2, R3, R4. R1 a little bit because you have a few dead blossoms, but not many. Okay, and we have seen that yes, you can get a response to a fungicide by applying at R4, but it's relatively minimal, usually. And so my recommendation to any grower applying that late is that he remembers he's only controlling new infections, not existing ones, and he applies something cheap because the response to the fungicide is going to be modest. You can get more response at R3, and obviously your optimal is earlier if conditions favor it then. Yeah, all right, thanks. Yeah.
Thanks, Michael.